Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to another session of Frames with Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans, inshallah. Today we will have a special guest, Brother Mobeen Vaid, and we'll be talking about prioritizing Islamic values in social activism and social justice work. So I'm really excited for today's session. A few announcements before we get started. We just released our spring program, inshallah. Our spring where's this link? Our spring classes with Ustadh Ubaydullah, Sheikh Adi, and Ustadh Zainab Ansari, inshallah. So I'll pull up the file for that, the flyer for that. But that will be starting very soon. It'll be, there we go. I lost my flyer, sorry. But March 6th through the April 10th, the topic will be Istighfar and Toba. It will be Ustadh Ubaydullah, Sheikh Adi, and Ustadh Zainab Ansari, inshallah. And the topics will be differences in types of Istighfar and Toba in the Quran and Sunnah, and Toba in Ramadan. This will be starting March 6th again through April 20th. The spring virtual program, and you can register at alimprogram.org, inshallah, for that. We also want to announce again our summer program is starting. The registration is open. You can go to alim. You can go to alimprogram.org/summer, inshallah, for that, to tune into that, and we'll be posting links in the chat to register for those and to learn more about them. And we also have our book club. So this month for the book club, we are reading Things Fall Apart, and that is next Wednesday, inshallah, at 8 p.m. Eastern time, which is our monthly book club. And so without further ado, we will get started with today's session. Bring Ustadh Ubaydullah on here. But I'm going to introduce Brother Mobeen. Brother Mobeen Vaid is a Muslim public intellectual and writer. He's a contributing writer for Muslim Matters, and his writings center on how traditional Islamic norms and frames of thinking intersect the modern world. In recent years, he has focused on Islamic sexual and gender norms, and he also serves as an advisor to Muslim college students and is a campus minister for the Muslim community at George Mason University. He has reviewed the study of Quran for the Journal of Islamic Sciences and published Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts? Quranic Revisionism in the Case of Scott Hugel for the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. And we are about to go ahead and get started, inshallah. Brother Mobeen and Ustadh Ubaydullah, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Mobeen.
MashaAllah, Sheikh Ubaydullah, how are you?
Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal, man. I'm well, man. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, mashallah. Your chair is very imposing, mashallah. Well, it's a virtual background, I suppose, one of the two.
That's not the adjective that some use to describe it, but I'll take it. Mashallah, man. How are things, man?
Alhamdulillah, no complaints, mashallah.
Mashallah. So what are you up to nowadays? When I just heard that you were reviewing a few different books and articles, and you're doing some chaplaincy at George Mason, right?
Yeah. So I still go to George Mason here and there. I don't like to talk about it because I don't think I'm very good at it. And so...
Well, if we could only talk about the things that we were good at, I probably can only talk about sleeping or something like that.
Yeah, but, I always feel like I'm so culturally aloof when I'm talking to college students. Every time I talk to them, I realize like I don't know what's going on in their lives. I'm so, even my points of reference have just passed like everyone by.
Yeah. I think some if that aloofness is actually as you describe it, some of it might serve to build some commonality between you and college students. I think I know when I was younger, if somebody in their presentation was very smooth and polished, it almost seemed inauthentic and rehearsed.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was, I'm still like my reference points are still like 90s and Tupac and stuff, and so I just know how like the things that I'll bring up don't immediately connect, and then I'll hear them talk about things, and I'm like, man, I don't know what's going on anymore with these kids.
But actually, I think there is some utility in that. I think one of the mistakes we make is thinking that college students, especially, are looking for us to. I mean, I think respectfully, we should know something about the world of the people we're addressing. But I'm not. If my legitimacy, I hope, isn't based on how well I know what your Netflix viewing consists of, or what's on your playlist, or I think it's kind of generally understood that I may not know those things, but what I hope is that I'm able to make connections between how you engage those things and how I engage, those aspects of those same aspects of culture, albeit different artists, different movies.
Well, that's what I hope for, right? That's what I'm writing on as well. So inshallah, there's some khair in it. So I do continue to do that. So I'll go out and help out the students there. But in addition to that, to your point, I'll get people on occasion who will send me articles that they've written or books, and they'll ask me to do reviews of those. So I'll read those through. It's not a formal thing. It's just informal requests that I'll get.
Okay.
And so I actually end up spending a lot of time doing that just because I get a lot of requests for that. Even though I don't know that I always have the most meaningful feedback to give them, I try just because I take that seriously. I recognize that, the very fact that people reach out to me means something to me. It tells me that they obviously care about my opinion and want me to review what they've taken quite a bit of time and invested time into writing. And so I try to give that as good an effort as I can. But aside from that, it's just work, family, and just the regular day-to-day, right?
MashaAllah. So I want to get to, the proposed topic of discussion.
Sure.
But just offering some background. I wasn't even aware that you were commenting on kind of, Muslim current events or, I've always, of course, I've known you for quite some time, but I've always known you as just, a very literate, very informed kind of, Muslim of conscience, but you have kind of emerged onto the scene as like a public intellectual voice in our community. And a lot of it, I could be wrong, but you can correct me. It was around this article you wrote for Muslim Matters.
Yeah, the first one was the Scott Kugel piece, definitely, which was a couple of years ago. So that was probably the big coming out party, so to speak, on, I guess no pun intended on that term, but yeah, I think that was the first major article that I wrote on the topic, and then since then it's just been a steady stream of articles that I've produced on the subject in some direction or angle tied to the topic.
This topic, particularly about Muslims and homosexual acts, why does it interest you?
Well, I think it interests me for a couple of reasons. I think one of them is obviously the fact that it's become a more difficult issue for a lot of Muslims, and especially young Muslims, but even old Muslims. I don't think this is one of those issues that we can look at and say, well, young Muslims are struggling with this. I think all Muslims are struggling with this in the West. And they're struggling with how they can navigate it, how they can defend their own convictions and values. They're struggling with what those values are. I have been surprised in many cases finding people who I would have assumed were otherwise solid, really destabilized on issues like this. And they feel as though they can't clearly and forthrightly articulate their values because they're so on guard about how those things are going to be interpreted, or they feel that, as stated, those values appear to lack in empathy and compassion. And so they come to internalize a set of doubts about certain aspects of the faith, which are really quite core and critical. And so far as they're not confused about what the Quran says, right? We're not talking about people who have a really deep degree of ambivalence or confusion over what's in the Quran itself. Where the confusion really lies is how the Quran can make sense in a world like ours, in the conditions that we're seeing in front of us, and with people who appear to them to be very normal and in dire need of public embrace. And that's certainly happened with other faith communities, which is another reason that this inspired my interest, was just the witnessing of what played out and what continues to play out in Christian and Jewish communities. And so you've had the formal fracturing of a number of denominations between liberal and conservative groups, with this particular issue being the pivot point that drove a wedge between them. You continue to have that taking place almost every day. The ones that continue along a conservative or orthodox path are constantly embroiled in controversy with how they're going to deal with this. And you're having more and more dissent, internal dissent, by people who are otherwise committed to the Orthodox tradition, but look at it as outdated on this specific issue. And so it's become the type of issue that is a conduit to unraveling a lot of core convictions and beliefs and confidence in revelation itself. So that's one of the issues, or one of the reasons that I started to write on it. And then, there are other reasons as well. Obviously, just witnessing what's happening to the Muslim community, witnessing what's happened to our political sphere and our political environment. Over the last few years, it's become much more caustic and freighted. People have and increasingly are moving towards a sort of authoritarian representation of their political interests. And so there is very little room for deliberation, for compromise and negotiation. What is in vogue today is political puritanism, and what you're having in many respects is a supplanting of religion as a locus of meaning and definition with political identities. And so political identities become the principal means through which I view myself. I form my own identity. I mediate my own relationship with the world around me and with people that I have relationships with. And that has become extremely it's a very vituperative environment. It's very vitriolic all the time. And so when you're in an environment that is just that constantly combative, you become ever more scared to even say what your beliefs are. And so recognizing all of those things converging, I felt that there was a significant vacuum within the Muslim community of people addressing this type of issue. My own temperament is generally more introverted. I'm not the type of person who would naturally want to come out on issues or speak out on things. And so this for me has been out of character in many ways, but I've done so and perhaps gotten a lot more comfortable doing so, simply because I've just felt that people need someone who's engaged with an issue like this. And the last thing I'll mention very quickly is that I think there are two ways to view this topic itself with homosexuality and transgenderism. I think there's one way to look at it and say, well, we're just dealing with a lot of culture wars, and this is just another culture war phase that the West is going through because of its frenetic, dysfunctional politics, and we'll get over it. I think there's another way to look at it and say that this is a watershed issue, especially for people of faith. And
I actually tend to view it in the latter kind of vein that you mentioned, that this is a shibboleth. This is, symbolic of a much larger issue that, to my mind, really involves how does a religion whose core, I guess, ethos espouse a kind of submission, makes sense of itself in a culture that, only recognizes the dignity of the human being, in as much as that human being is an autonomous, unencumbered chooser. Right. And I think that, for Islam to kind of articulate itself against that cultural backdrop in an intelligible way, I think it's very, very difficult. I think a lot of the articles that I've read from very fair and balanced and circumspect reviewers, researchers, public intellectuals, the problem I think that many of us are having is that we want to shift the terms of the debate, right? So like when this issue is presented to me, I'm always saying, I don't really view it because I'm trained in the tradition. I don't view it as an issue of identity, but just an issue of tasarrufat, just an issue of behavior, right? So I'm always kind of making the parallel that the Sharia, right, the ahkam of the Sharia, the rulings of the Sharia are actually irrelevant to identities. They're only relevant to actions. Like it can't be haram to be black. It can't be mustahab to be tall. It can't be makruh to be short. It's not, but but when people talk about sexual identity, I think kind of the voice of our cultural moment is that we're not talking about something that's limited to, discretionary acts. We're talking about identities, essences. And I recognize that, when a person attempting to articulate the traditional view says these acts are unlawful or impermissible religiously, what I think the contemporary listener is hearing is that I'm impermissible.
Yeah.
I'm unlawful. And it's like, no, there's no such thing as a person that's unlawful. There's no such thing as an essence that's unlawful. And, so I'm always confused, and maybe we can converse a bit about that.
Yeah, I remember during the sort of presidential nomination process for the last election, there was a LGBT town hall that the Democratic candidates held. And Elizabeth Warren was asked about whether she's ever struggled to reconcile her beliefs as a Christian with her positions on, LGBT, affirmation and being part of that political project and program and an advocate for it. And her response was very telling and interesting in that she said that she never had to reconcile the Bible and giving people the dignity that they deserve and affirming their full humanity. Those two things have, for her, always been aligned. There was never a point at which those two things would ever be viewed as in conflict. And to your point, I think that that presupposes a number of things to actually get to that framing, but it's indicative of where the modern mind is at with an issue like this, where when you do try to disentangle everything within the identity web, what you get accused of is dehumanizing people.
Exactly. So it becomes an issue, I guess, of do we endeavor to change the, terms of engagement, or are we forced to engage with the given terms, right? Do we have to accept the given terms and engage? And what I find interesting about this is that if you look at how Muslims have traditionally dealt with civilizational expansion and civilizational encounter, on some issues, you'll find a lot of these, the older issues are theological issues. On some issues, Muslims, endeavor to, shift the terms, shift the categories of discussions. And on some issues like theology, for instance, they accepted a Neoplatonist, kind of ontology and then built an Islamic theology on top of that.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a really interesting kind of, do we say, wait, hold on, I don't accept these terms? Or do we say, okay, let's take those terms for granted. How can we still kind of sensibly and ethically articulate the ideals of our faith?
Yeah, and I think the work we have to do is the work of discernment, right? The extent to which categories and terms allow us to build a moral schema that is consistent and sustains our core convictions and beliefs. We don't necessarily have a problem with that, right? We're speaking in English, right? We use all sorts of terms and categories that aren't immediately indigenous to our tradition. And so far as we're not frequently or consistently taking recourse to Arabic terms every single time we speak about Islam. And we do recognize that substantively there are differences in the way we may invoke a term in English with how those terms exist in Arabic. A term like salah and prayer aren't apples to apples, right? They convey different things, right? What people think about in prayers in the West, right? Like, the cliche of "you're in my prayers," right? In the West. That term is very ambiguous and amorphous, It's kind of like it's a way you may give someone condolences or reassurance, but
sure.
But it doesn't, like, what the person's actually going to do to give effect to that statement is completely up in the air.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Whereas, when you oftentimes speak to a person in a more Islamic context, you may say something like, La tansani fi du'aik, right? Don't forget me in your dua, right? Don't forget me in your dua, or I'll make dua for you, or I'll remember them in my duas, right?
Sure.
And so you're actually saying something very specific that's immediately apprehensible as to what you're going to do. You're going to make dua, which is a very specific religious act of worship. And as part of that, you're going to beseech Allah for his forgiveness and mercy, or help or aid or assistance for whoever it is that you're speaking to. So even at that level, you may say that there are divergences, but nevertheless, we can still use these terms because those divergences aren't so grand that they make the religion inapprehensible, right? Or severely undermine our ability to communicate our faith. I think sometimes the problem ends up becoming that we are invoking terms and categories in a way where we're not self-conscious about the entailments of the terms that we're actually using, and we're actually employing them in ways that directly undermine our ability to articulate a coherent sense of what it is that our faith actually says, right?
No, I agree wholeheartedly, Mobeen. I mean, even like if we look at this issue in particular from its very base, I can't really find a classical Islamic equivalent to the idea of sexuality. Like, what is sexuality? What is that? Meaning like heterosexuality, homosexuality. You won't find a synonym or an analog for those ideas in classical Islamic books. They deal with sexuality in a much more fluid and almost amorphous way. It's a kind of energy that flows between people, but it doesn't become concretized until a decision is made, until a sexual act is performed. That before an act, it has almost, as I mentioned, almost like an amorphous character. You know what I'm saying? But when we say sexuality, we almost mean like a predetermined proclivity, a predetermined inclination, or even very specific frame inside which one's sexual desires will take shape.
Well, and sometimes it's even more than that. We're talking about an immutable feature of who you are, as well as how that immutable feature manifests itself culturally, socially, politically, religiously, and everything else.
Exactly.
And so suddenly, we're dealing with somebody who now has to determine and decide on the basis of experiencing some contingent desire whether or not they're going to come out of the closet. And if they do come out of the closet, that is going to be significant insofar as that decision now bears consequence on how they think and view religion, or how they view God, right? And what they think about politics, right? Or how they regard certain social issues. And so there's a socialization process that takes place through the symbolic act of taking on a unique and, not terribly unique in our times, but, historically unique identity that really doesn't have a lot of precedent to it pre-19th century, right?
Yeah, it's not, it's, Douglas Murray, who I know some people take issue with Douglas Murray, but his book, The Madness of Crowds, I like the way he termed it. There is still real debate around whether or not sexuality is a hardware issue or a software, issue. In the Islamic tradition, it's definitely something that's seen as more of a software issue that is socially informed, culturally informed. One point that Douglas Murray made, and himself, I believe he identifies as a gay man. He said that, it's strange that people could spend an entire lifetime, engaging in a certain kind, a very specific kind of sexual practice, and then begin engaging in a different kind of sexual practice and deem everything that happened before that as just inauthentic. It was just social conformity. It was just, almost like it can just be, jettisoned and dismissed as earsats. But then the sexual practice now is somehow regarded as, real, determinative, truthful. And he said, well, just as analogies, those two are equivalents, right? The sexual practice then and the sexual practice now, you were making a different choice then for different reasons than you appear to be making now. But it's our culture that makes this seem more authentic. But it's, when you boil it down, that was a choice and this is also a choice. But that's the context in which we're living.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A number of thinkers, especially within queer scholarship, tend to take the choice-based position. Mm-hmm. They recognize the arguments of biological determinism or some other determinism were needed. They were needed historically to get past religious objection, but they recognized that a lot of those arguments were never meaningfully substantiated to a point where they could actually be defended. And by now, they actually feel that part of the problem there was that they were having to contend with various forms of bigotry. And the only way that they could overcome those bigotries was by trying to assert this, very irreducible, immutable sense of self that, was being impinged upon such that, a person couldn't even live or exist fully as a result of all of these, as a result of social and public opposition. Now that they've gotten past it, there's a sense of, okay, we can have a bit of a more honest conversation and review of what it is that's taking place. And we should embrace the idea of choice because we're making choices. There are choices. And those choices are no less legitimate simply because they are a choice.
Choices,
right?
And I always felt that the core of that, the position that necessitated the biodeterministic argument was this. I think it was just a bigotry that community was forced to contend with, and in many cases, a persecution that community was forced to contend with. And I think part of shifting the paradigm is saying that I can think and believe that someone's lifestyle choice is morally wrong, unacceptable, incomprehensible, and still recognize the fullness of their humanity and treat them with, dignity and great grace and great amity and great friendship, even in some cases.
Yeah, and in fact, part of our struggle is in trying to convey the fact that what we're calling people to is a life of dignity, right? What we're recognizing is that immoral acts derogate from the full dignity of a human being. And if people succumb to their own vices, they aren't liberating themselves. What they're doing is enslaving themselves into a particular lifestyle, into a particular path that is destructive, both for their own even sort of psychosocial health and dunya relations, as well as in the hereafter in front of God. And so being able to convey that in a way that is rationally apprehensible is important. But obviously we have to get to a point where we can at least engage people with a discourse that's going to make some sense to them. And in order to do that, we have to peel back the onion a number of different layers and go back to first principles. And sometimes that can appear a bit pedantic, like, oh my God, like we're just going back to, all of these like first layer issues where we can't even agree on how we look at justice or how we think about human anthropology and human beings. We have to start thinking about questions of teleology and human purpose and the way that God created certain things. We have to talk about all of this, right? And it just becomes very convoluted sometimes in people's minds because the alternative just comes to people intuitively, right? It comes very intuitively to people. Right. So I think the work that we have to do is a lot more difficult, which is why I try to make a point of just about every single article I write of trying to reassert the moral issue as a priority issue and talking about morality as something that has a coherence to it, that Islamic sexual ethics are not just arbitrary, but they're something that reflect a divine purpose, and they actually contribute to the formation of a healthy society. Right? And I think when people can have that type of confidence in what Islam has to say on sexuality, on family, and they can recognize the dangers and problems that come from abandoning the family, from abandoning the human community, that's really important, right?
I think that's a worthwhile project. And I also engage in similar kinds of, activity when speaking, when writing, when teaching. But one thing I've been cautioned against is when it comes to making religious arguments on the basis of public reason, right?
Sure.
You can end up almost trapping yourself, because it reminds me of something Imam Malik said. Now, I realize that fideism, or just saying because God said so, is never going to be acceptable in our public discourse, right? If they ask me, why is this wrong? And I say, because God says it's wrong. No, that's probably not going to fly. But internally, we have to almost remind each other very intentionally that we will attempt to offer a rational basis for what God said in the name of hikmah, in the name of wisdom, right? In the name of da'wah and invitation. But really, the basis for our adherence to these principles is really that God said it. And you know what I'm saying? And if you blur that line, you can end up in a place that I think subjects religion to scrutiny that religion often cannot, offer any real answers for.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. So obviously there's sort of, there's a what's the saying, there's always this chicken and egg scenario when it comes to the theological differences or debate over morality and the origins of morality, which is to say, there's some people who say, tahsin and taqbih, right, is right and wrong, or good and evil because God said so, or did God say so because they're good and evil, right? In either case, we would say that good and evil definitely reflect God's divine command. Certainly there are some aspects of our faith that we look at as being more tawqifiyat, right, in the sense that they're evidences of our submission to him, right, and we may not be able to glean the same type of wisdoms out of them. To your point, I mean, someone might look at the prohibition of our consumption of swine and say, well, that's just part of the program, right? You submit to God, you follow Islam, and part of what you don't do is consume swine, right? You give it up, right? If you were doing that before. And that's not something that we're going to go to great pains to argue over. We're just going to say that this is part of submission. It's not a major sacrifice. You can still eat meat and all types of meat, but this is one that you can't consume. On sexuality, you're right. I think that one of the challenges we have today is you do have a community of social scientists and even some philosophers that look at religion as possessing a certain social utility. So religion is not good because it inherently provides a message of truth or because it answers the big questions in life. Religion is good because it is useful for the masses to organize them sociologically, and we are better as a people when we have community, and we can measure the effect of religion when it comes to people's psychosocial health, and we can apply quality of life metrics to what religion brings into the world. And so religion in that scenario gets reduced into something that is possesses more of a utilitarian benefit. And so you have this like social science view of religion as opposed to a view of religion as really a path of salvation, as something that attempts to or provides answers to the single most meaningful questions in the world, which is, why do I exist? Why am I here? Right? How am I rationalizing my existence in the world? It is answering questions about God and the hereafter and everything else. And it is not only answering those questions, but it's providing me revelation and divine instruction and this corpus and canon of truth that I have to do what I can to submit to and live in accordance with. And so a lot of that, you're right, does get elided when all we're doing is talking about religion through the prism of social science. And I think that is an alluring prospect simply because we have people in some domains of life that are allies on that, even though they're totally irreligious. And they don't care a great deal about, like, do they care about God? No, God's like a nice belief for them, right? Like, it's a nice thing to believe. I think it's a good thing if most people believe in God, but it's like the old falasifa of old, right? The awam, sort of the general populace needed religion, but because they had reached a certain level of intelligence, it was superfluous for them, right? And so when you're just approaching religion that way, you do risk you do risk trivializing a lot of the core convictions of what religion is actually revealed for. Right?
I always say that rationalizing religious truths is a great tool for conversation. It's a great tool for reaching across the aisle, but not a great tool for kind of rooting your own faith. It reminds me of the statement attributed to Imam Malik that if your belief in God is based on a rational proof, what will happen when someone gives you a superior rational proof for the non-existence of God? You know what I'm saying? So I think it's but it is necessary. I think it is quite frankly lazy and undesirably fideistic to just say we have nothing to contribute to this public conversation, but because God said it and I'm religious, it's what I believe. Now, if that is where the conversation goes, and I'm forced to say that, I have no problem saying that, but I would hope to offer something that even someone who isn't religious would be able to understand or see some merit in our point of view.
Well, and I find that a lot of times people are just intimidated by others who are making counter arguments more so than really doing. I mean, I think if someone really spends time reviewing the scholarship or reviewing, especially public discourse on a lot of these issues, they're very superficial, right? You're dealing with arguments that aren't the most sophisticated. Transgenderism is a great example, right? So much of transgenderism isn't meaningfully interrogated in the public square. There are aspects of transgenderism that in polite discourse, you are not allowed to broach or even ask questions about.
Yes.
And so even things that are very evident, that we have a ton of now statistics and research around, and we have all sorts of medical concerns. And it's like, okay, well, are we not allowed to even bring those things up? Why not? And if I raise them sort of genuinely and sincerely, trying to understand why it is that this particular concern is completely off limits as part of this discussion, the only counter to that quite often is the counter of power, which is to just completely dismiss and stifle the conversation from ever gaining steam, or to shut people up, or to feign emotional outrage and to become very high-strung. And I think there's only so many times you can go to that well before people begin to see the forest from the trees, right?
Sometimes, Mobeen, that in our time, that well appears inexhaustible. It's all, they go to it and go to it and go to it. And I was remarking to my wife today that, saying something was problematic aforetime, that just meant that it was worth being interrogated. That this is something that we need to talk about. This is something it produces problems that people interested in discourse will investigate, interrogate, converse about. But now saying something is problematic is a way of shutting down conversation, shutting down discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think sometimes that's just a function of just how polarized our society has become.
Agreed.
I think this way oftentimes when I think of what's happened with COVID, right? Like, I don't even attempt to bring that topic up, even with friends, because I just realize how quickly it snowballs and how aggressive people get on a topic like that.
Yes.
And so I would rather, I mean, I'm just not passionately disposed one way or another on a topic like that. I have opinions here and there, but you know, whatever. But I was reading recently a work by Chris Bale.
Okay.
He talks about social media, and he refers to them as social media prisms. It's really the echo chamber effect of social media. And one of the things he researched and did a study on was this whole notion of echo chambers and whether or not exposing people to contrasting views would actually have the effect of opening people's minds up to competing perspectives. And so what he did was he found a collection of individuals, which was a reasonable sample size, of people who were indifferent to their partisan affiliations. So they were soft conservatives or soft liberals, people who had voted with the Republican or Democratic Party in the past, but didn't feel beholden to the party itself. They didn't feel as though that party was like their core central identity. And what they did was they used they made some sort of bot on Twitter, and he had them all create Twitter accounts, and he made that bot surface for them as part of their Twitter feeds competing news stories from outlets that they wouldn't ordinarily read.
Oh, wow.
And the effect of that was actually that it hardened them in their partisanship. So whereas they were more in the center previously, they became full-on partisan and extremely hostile to competing perspectives simply by being exposed to them.
Wow.
And
I actually expected the opposite to happen.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And he talks about how they repeated it within a number of times because they were so surprised by it. And every single time they did it, he said the result was exactly the same. And you know, part of his explanation behind that is that when people get exposed to even competing views, what it does is it actually foments within them a very deep political identity. Right? It foments a very deep political identity. So, you know, it actually tribalizes them, and it creates a lot of cultishness, right? And so, you know, you just think about that dynamic and how many people are on social media and how many people are so passionate about political issues. Well, this is like an aqidah issue, right? Within the realm of contemporary politics. And depending on how you affiliate yourself politically, this becomes the type of issue for a lot of people who are predisposed to leftist politics, where they look at it and they say, I'm not entertaining a meaningful discussion on this. I'm not even going to open my mind to the idea that we can have a conversation or a talk on this. And I am going to pre-commit myself to a maximalist view of LGBT affirmation, even if that means that view is going to result in my children receiving LGBT studies in schools, even if it means that LGBT ubiquity is going to get, you know, further and further entrenched, and it's going to undermine my ability to, even as a religious actor in my own spaces, in my own communities, so much as speak, preach, and teach about my faith, right? I mean, that's really where a lot of that challenge comes in.
Hold on 1 second, I got kids all over me. Hold on 1 second.
No problem at all. I get it, man.
My God. Okay. Okay, but no. You make a very, very strong point. You know, I think this is probably a good segue. You know, we spent 45 minutes just tangentially discussing this issue of you know, the Muslim community and LGBTQ affirmation. But what the proposed topic was just Muslims and Islamic principles in social activism.
Sure.
You know, I don't know about you, but in talking to a lot of young people, I feel like there's this really false, to my mind, dichotomy that the Muslim community has been investing in between activists and scholars. You know, and although when I call it a false dichotomy, I think that it minimizes the religiosity of social activists, and it minimizes also the deep civic mindedness and social concern of scholars. But there is some tension there. Right.
Yeah, I agree with you insofar as what it does in some ways is that it allows a certain group of activists to set the terms of what it means to be an activist, right? And so there are many wonderful activists in our community, right? I mean, I look at someone, and there are many people who straddle both sides of that fence very well. I look at someone like, Imam Dawood Walid, who I just love, mashallah. I mean, mashallah.
As do I. Who doesn't love Imam Dawood?
And I know he catches flack from a lot of people and whatever, right? Not everyone's going to agree with something, but I think he operates out of a deep sense of conviction. He cares a lot about social issues and issues of social justice. He participates with them as part of his full-time job as well, right? He's a deeply religious person who cares a lot about Islam. And that concern for Islam is what drives him to actually try to participate in the public square as a Muslim, right? Like, why isn't his activism something that gets foregrounded as more definitional to how we view activists, as opposed to, just a handful of very token, maybe younger left-wing activists that have less concern for the faith, right? So the idea is that you're right. Like, there's that problem where what you're doing is you're stereotyping activism through the lens of a very small group of activists. And then you're also not giving any credence to religious scholars and people that have religious convictions, insofar as they do care about social issues and they do care about the public good, right? These aren't people who are just so hardened to injustice that they're going to sit back and be indifferent to it. I think part of what's happened on that side as well is that there has been a fixation on certain scholars that have either made statements that were unfortunate, or alternatively, even scholars overseas that seem to, make regrettable, unfortunate, and sometimes just downright bad decisions when it comes to speaking about really clear issues of right and wrong. And so, what you do is you kind of tar all ulama, all people of knowledge, because of the mistakes and wrong conclusions of perhaps very, very few scholars sometimes. And, that somehow comes to define all scholars. And then you take the activists and then you promote up, a certain subset, and you say that's what it means to be an activist. And you create a public conflict between these two camps in a way that dissembles everybody that doesn't neatly fall into one side or the other, right? I mean, I don't consider myself an activist. I mean, I don't know, maybe I am an activist, but I go to protests, right? I've been to protests in the past. I went to a rally relatively recently. I mean, I attend them, right? I've been to a relatively recent one for Afghanistan, right? For ending Afghan starvation, which is a really important issue right now, right? That's not an issue that I'm just like blasé about. And likewise with other issues, right? And so I think people of religion have to care about public issues, especially ones that are grounded and coincide and have no problem with us vis-a-vis our faith, right? And so you're right. I mean, I do see that, and I do see the way that discussion of like scholars versus activists just creates a certain framing of issues that I think is counterproductive. I think it's counterproductive for Muslims to
exactly, and I think it's inaccurate. I think it's counterproductive, and I think it's inaccurate. But I do realize, especially on the activist side, some people use the term activism, but what they're describing, to my mind, is kind of an alternative or even a countervailing kind of morality. That we have a different morality than religious scholars, and one that they think is, more mature or more humanistic or more ethical or better, just to, for lack of a better term. And I know that you take, some issue with this.
Yeah, I do for various reasons. Obviously, because it is such a deeply rooted moral program, what you're going to do is view your own religion and faith as immoral, And if that's not explicitly stated, that's an implicit part of the discourse, right? Which is a really big problem, because now we're starting from a position where religion is on the defensive. So I think that's a problem. I think the other issue we have as a result of what we talked about with political socialization is that you have many people now who their activism is motivated and fueled through that deeper political identity that's being expressed day to day. And so my principal affiliation is with my political tribe, and everything else is subordinate to that and gets conditioned and qualified through that lens. And that politics begins to answer for me really some of the most meaningful questions in my life, right?
Really like, axial questions.
Absolutely, right? Like some of the big questions of truth and justice and what it means to be a good person. You know, even it gives me mission, right? There's a sense of mission that I can take away as a result of my political activism. People who go headlong into this can oftentimes lose their way. And so it's worth cautioning against that type of path insofar as people are unable to untether themselves from a particular mode of activism, which can have a indoctrinating effect, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, but one thing that I'm wary of doing is I don't want to alienate young activists that identify as Muslim. So every time I go into one of those scholars versus activists kind of settings, I'm always trying to diffuse, and I'm also, you know, deeply invested in showing the, you know, how spiritually commendable it is to want to alleviate harm, to want to, address human suffering, to want to, serve marginalized folks and under-resourced folks. And that I don't want activists to think that those moral values are not deeply Islamic values, so that they would have to seek those things in other moral schemes, other kind of moral teachings. But in Islam, those values, while vaunted and celebrated and esteemed, are put in conversation with other values, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I try to do is I usually take the tack of at least probing, right? And I find that probing can be very revealing, right? And so I remember one time there was an MSA in the area, and this was after George Floyd. And there was this discussion about, hey, we have to do an event on racial justice and Black America. I said, that's a great idea. I think you should. And then they started throwing out names, and they mentioned a number of prominent Black Muslim scholars and voices. And I said, and I just asked them. I said, I don't think you've ever invited any of these people before to your university or to do a program with you. I said, do you think that it might be prudent to invite them to talk about things that have nothing to do with race? Because these are also people of knowledge in Islam, right? The people who have studied the deen, like they're just not here to talk about Black America. That's an issue that they can contribute to, but there's a lot else that they can contribute to as well, right? And they were all very much in agreement with that. Actually, almost immediately they recognized, like, yeah, we shouldn't just seek these people out to talk about race every single time. Like, they can talk about a ton of stuff. Like, we don't want to tokenize them, right? Like, that would be unfortunate, that even if we're trying to do something that's positive, but now what the byproduct of that is a tokenizing of really valuable people in our community. What we're doing is trivializing their scholarship and their intelligence and their contributions, and we're typecasting them in a way that they might not even like, right? And so, I'll start probing that way just to get them to try to appreciate sometimes the entailments of even things that might be done with the best of intentions, right? Things are being done with good intentions, but now you have to take a step back and say, okay, if this is what I want to accomplish, how do I accomplish that in a more meaningful way, right? And I find, especially when it comes to, a lot of these types of issues of sexuality and gender and things like that, many people are just uninformed about even the histories of these things. And so when you're able to parochialize some of this through the prism of Western modernity, you begin to realize that, hey, this is actually quite new, quite recent. it has been advanced through a variety of elite interests. Some of these things just like came about in the last few years.
Yeah.
Our own tradition, speaks about these things in very different ways and thinks about them in very different ways. And by the way, that type of way of viewing and speaking about these things can actually be a lot more liberating for the individual insofar they're not constantly encumbered with this like identity decision vis-a-vis their own sexual attraction, right? They can just go about the job of living as human beings and trying to make moral decisions in their lives. And I think that type of work, when we relativize contemporary Western values and mores, can actually be very eye-opening to people, even young people. I think many of them are available to those things, provided that we approach things in a way that they'll be more open to, right? And I don't think it's always going to be done perfectly, but I think it's doable. I think it is doable. I've had success with it. I don't pretend to be a person who convinces everybody, but I've had more success than I thought I would. And I have found that
I find that a lot of, once you provincialize the West and show, I always say to people that, the real danger of, kind of, a Western, ethnocentrism or a white supremacy is not the stuff that we're reading about. It's all the invisibility of, things that are just taken for granted, things that are regarded as normative, things that are presented as though they don't represent very distinct, ways of knowing, feeling, being, but instead are treated as just thawabit, just these pillars of what it means to be a normal human being. Now, if you begin from that point of view, anything that looks different will have to explain itself. But if you begin from, okay, it's a distinct kind of cultural history, religious history. I think that the way that we talk about these issues, all three of them, race, gender, and sexuality, in kind of the contemporary idiom, it goes, I mean, for me, it goes back to Christianity. It goes back to Christendom. It goes back to Western Europe. And then, because the Enlightenment is a response to Christianity. It's a, I believe, and my German is terrible, but I believe that the word for enlightenment is Afkharun, which means in German like a way out, because the Catholic Church had become so overbearing in its control over the lives of the members of the church, right? So I think, even this, kind of, post-French Revolution elevation of the human being and the individual to the place that was once reserved for God is a response to a very distinct kind of theology, a very distinct kind of history. But it's often given to unsuspecting members of our community as though, it's just life.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? I mean, you look at high humanism and the Renaissance, and then you have the Reformation, and then the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, and all these things are happening. And this goes back to, even you have sociologists and thinkers like Max Weber, who talks about a secularization thesis, where societies become more secular, they advance in the sciences, right? Like those two things have to occur simultaneously. And that was the West experience, right? As it became less and less Christian, as the Catholic Church's hegemony was destabilized and began to attenuate, society was able to explore different realms of existence and elevate the human condition. That wasn't our historical experience. We had very successful and flourishing civilizations where you had people like, Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, this and that, and they're writing and they're producing their intellectual contributions at the same time as a Ghazali or someone else. Like they're not, like one doesn't have to fall for the other to climb.
And also too, I think the other really important factor, there's a decentralized religious and political authority, that there isn't, this idea of, and this is, I think, what you were referring to, that it is only through destroying kind of the edifice of religion that other elements of the human condition can even be given voice. That just wasn't the case in classical Islam.
Well, right? and it's also different insofar that it doesn't, classical Islam was much more at home with human reason insofar that it didn't fetishize the human mind, right? Like the Enlightenment did. Where now that, especially for postmodernism, becomes something that's very easy to critique, because you say, well, what is reasoning? Is reasoning just this like monolithic process that we can look at, free of any subjectivities, biases, prejudices, or anything else? Or is it a social construction? Is it a human project? Is it all of those things, right? And say, no, like our tradition didn't elevate reason above all other factors, but it produced a certain type of reason-based discourse that still valued thinking and valued engagement with the world. And, that was sort of a negotiated process that was critiqued, and it went on. But nevertheless, people were able to engage with different spheres of human existence without being insecure about how those things were going to infringe upon their religious convictions. The idea that I'm doing something that's irreligious, right? Or that is immediately contradictory to my like that type of framing of religion versus faith, or faith versus my secular interests, right? Is very, very modern, right? For a person to think about secular activities in a way that is necessarily cordoned off from religion and sometimes even oppositional to it as a presumptive matter is a very much an artifact of post-Catholic modernity, especially with the last 300-400 years. So
and this, for that reason, sometimes, and you can chime in and tell me what you think. I think what we need more than anything else is we need artists, we need creatives, we need designers, we need people that just help to provide context in which we can at least experience some of the normative values of our kind of religious tradition. Because I think inside of those normative values, these arguments, right, these hot button issues, they take on different complexions. You see, it looks different, inside a context that's shaped by some of the normative values of Islam, but inside a context that is completely dominated by the normative values of traditions alien to Islam, Islam struggles to articulate itself cogently.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the challenge that we have in producing those types of things is really developing a meaningful countercultural community. And that's tough, not just for us, it's tough for everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah, it's tough for everybody. No one has it easy today, because what you have is you have a number of fractures that had existed previously, but now are exacerbated. So for instance, you have this huge debate over secularism and the definition of secularism. Traditionally you had a softer notion of political secularism, especially in the United States, where the idea behind secularism is that we're just going to avoid establishing a specific religion as the religion of the state. Now, there are a lot of critiques as to the coherence of even that commitment, but nevertheless, the idea was never that a person can't bring religion to bear in public society, or that I can't talk about my beliefs in the public square. That was that certainly wasn't the understanding of most people in America up through late 20th century, right?
Even Stephen Carter's Culture of Disbelief. Yeah. Have you read that book?
I haven't.
That's on this topic particularly, that's a worthwhile read. The aim was just the establishment clause of the Constitution is, as you mentioned, the state does not establish a particular religious tradition or church or entity, but it was never to make all of public life forcibly devoid of reference to one's belief or convictions. That's crazy.
Yeah, so that latter view is what some scholars refer to as philosophical secularism, right? Where now philosophical secularism demands that religion be increasingly privatized and sequestered to a person's home and their church and their community, and that those things, the extent to which they're going to be expressed in the public square, have to be smuggled in through non-religious reasoning, right? And so Stephen Smith writes a lot about the smuggling process of the secularists, right? Where what they're doing is that they're advancing their own morals, beliefs, and values with all sorts of metaphysical commitments, but they advance them through a particular form of reasoning where all of those things are invisible and no longer open for debate, right? And so,
what book would you recommend by Stephen Smith? Because I haven't heard of the author. I would love to read about this stuff.
Yes, Smith is. I actually like his books just because I find them very accessible. There's one book, The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse. That book is very good. Disenchantment. I think he's the University of UC San Diego. I think that's where he's based. But he has that book. He has a couple other books on secularism, but I think that one's sort of his foundational text. There are obviously more dense critiques of secularism, right? You have Taylor and you have McIntyre, that and you have all those types of things. But I think for people who just want to get an introduction to that, I think he does a phenomenal job of and his case study review, even the harm principle, all these types of things. He does a good job of just problematizing them in a way that really opens up your eyes to, wow, like there's so little substance to so many of these things that we consider to be canonical, right? Like these are canonical aspects of the modern political state, and yet they seem to be so hollow and vacuous, right? And you look at them and say, wow, I'm this person who's like scared to talk.
Right. And another touchstone on this issue of secularism is Christopher Lash's The True and Only Heaven.
Yeah.
Very, very good book. And when you read those kinds of texts, you're thinking, there's really no usul. Like, we're talking about this, and it doesn't really go back to an asl. And here I have like this belief system of 1,400 years and this amazing tradition of conversation and public discourse about these issues. And I'm like shaking in my boots when I want to say anything. It's like, wallahi, this is completely ma'akus.
Well, right? and if you think about the way politics goes today, that's really so evident, right? It's so manifest because you can have people who have this eclectic collection of positions that have no usul that cut across them at all.
No.
Right? Conservatives have a maximalist view of life protection, but then, COVID comes in and they take the exact opposite position. And then, you have Hollywood that takes a very pseudoscience approach towards pharmaceuticals and things like that. They're very suspicious of the medical establishment and they take a maximalist view of it. And so you have all of these things, right?
You forgot
that are just being done very eclectically.
You forgot to mention evangelicals that are Second Amendment. I'm thinking Gospel of Christ.
Yeah.
Gun fetishization. Yeah. Help me make sense of that. Yeah.
Evangelicals rally behind the least religious political actor, forget president, the least religious political actor that we arguably have ever seen in American history. I mean, he was the least religious man by a mile. I don't know that we have had a politician.
They asked the man, Mobeen, they asked him in an interview, do you ever repent? And he said, for what? I never commit sins.
I remember. I was astonished because he mentioned that at Liberty University. And he said something about, I don't know that I ever could ask God for forgiveness. And I thought, like, if that is not the most unadulterated expression of kibr that I have ever heard in my entire life, like just the arrogance
I was thinking to
say something like that.
I'm thinking to myself, wait. We worship the God of Abraham? The man just said, ask God for forgiveness for what? And evangelicals rallied behind him. This is just kind of a very sad kind of anecdote, but
you have these type of contradictions. They abound
this mishmash of political positions, affiliations, with no asl, no basis,
and it's remarkable. It's remarkable to witness because you can take people who know virtually nothing about an issue, and virtually overnight, almost instantaneously, they become so impassioned about it. Like this thing that's going on right now in Canada with truckers, I don't know anything about it, right? I don't know a whole lot about trucking or what their lives are like. I know that they're opposing vaccine mandates and they're protesting. And then you have counter protests, and you have people who have, like, within a matter of days, become so passionate about this issue. And, to be candid, I don't think most of those people care about truckers.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think most of them care about, I don't think most of them really even care about whether or not these truckers are getting vaccinated. I'm not sure that they care a great deal about vaccine mandates. It's almost as if what's happened is that people are just looking for a fight. They're just looking for a fight. Like, they're just looking to get into arguments with people and duke it out. And this issue became convenient for them to just go back at it over.
Yeah, no, I think, and this is one of my, kind of wily views, but I think that human beings are predisposed to attaching themselves to different kinds of dogma. And in fact, I don't think we can exist as just purely empirical beings.
Yeah.
I don't believe. So I think a lot of this is because religious dogma has been discredited publicly. Politics is becoming kind of a new pseudo kind of, I think it's filling a space of kind of religious fervor that, religion used to occupy.
Well, and you're right. And this is one of the problems that happens when Muslims articulate their faith one way or the other in culture war terms. Because all you do is you exacerbate that partisanship and that partisan identity instead of helping Muslims actually escape it, right?
Exactly.
Which is I think itself a problem, because I think sometimes Muslims will say we don't want to alienate Muslims, right? Which is a worthwhile motive, but they'll do so by backing a particular partisan program, which doesn't have immediate religious consequence or significance. But it's simply showing people that, hey, look, we can be on sort of the cool side. And that oftentimes has unintended consequences, right? So, I was reading a study recently by a researcher at Stanford. His name's Floyd Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G. And he did this about the scientific journal called Nature. It's a very old journal, very credible journal. We have a lot of medical research that gets published. So Nature, as well as the New England Journal of Medicine, both for the first time in their histories endorsed a political candidate in 2020. They endorsed Biden. They came out. And so for the New England Journal of Medicine, over 200 years old, it's the first time they've ever done it. For Nature, as old as it is, it's the first time they've ever done it. And he studied sort of what was the aftermath of that. How did that affect their readership? And he found that amongst their readership that was far left, like really devoted to liberalism as an active commitment, it actually didn't change their perspective towards the journal at all. Wow. It didn't increase their confidence in it. It didn't change their political opinions. It kept them where they were, and they reported being mildly happy with the journal. But for everyone else, it actually made them view the journal as less credible.
Wow.
Everyone else viewed it as being less credible because they came out on that particular issue and they said, look, it's such an important election that we can't stay silent. And yet the net effect of that is that everybody that wasn't like a dogged liberal looks at them and says, well, this is really just not a
now it's like everything they say is discredited. Some people, anything that they don't like can just be dismissed as fake news.
Yeah. And so I remember many Muslims, for instance, were supporting, you had mosques, for instance, in 2020 that were, they were canvassing for Bernie Sanders. And I think
I heard about people that were doing, a khatam of Quran for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I heard about that as well. That seemed to get a lot of coverage. But I thought to myself, like the mosque, like that's a really unfortunate thing, because what you're doing is like the youth that are going to be there who are already pro-Bernie, their opinion of the mosque probably isn't going to change a great deal. I don't know that they're going to just start attending the masjid every single day just because you like worked for their political candidate. But for everybody else, there is going to be a type of alienation for them.
Of course.
Because there's going to be a sense of like, okay, can I even belong in this community? Because it's become such a partisan environment politically. Like it hasn't demonstrated to me that its own convictions can transcend partisan politics. right?
Which is really unfortunate because we have a tradition of khilaf, of difference of opinion in big things like theology, God's will, the positive law. In our tradition, people have always been able to disagree about those things, and it has been a very fruitful and productive disagreement. I mean, voluminous bodies of literature have been produced around these disagreements. Now, at times, those disagreements have become toxic, but at times, those disagreements have, been very productive. But when it comes to issues of like contemporary politics, Muslims can't even disagree.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, there's a lot more khilaf, like just amongst the madahib and difference of opinion amongst the madahib than anything that you would find in contemporary politics. Like the range of available opinions that people can take. There was an article I was reading, actually it was during the last election. It was a woman who was a career Democrat, and she had been a pro-life Democrat. And there was space previously for pro-life Democrats. There was room for them within the party. And she simply she wrote this article about the fact that she wasn't a Republican, but she was kind of put in a position where she couldn't be a Democrat anymore. Wow. Right? Like there were like no, like, and there was a Q&A. I want to say it was at like one of those state fairs in Ohio or something, where a woman asked Pete Buttigieg about that. She said, "Can I be a pro-life Democrat?" And I'm paraphrasing, but part of his response was to say, "Look, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't think that's a legitimate position within our party." Wow. Right? I don't think that's a legitimate position. He's like, "I respect you holding that position, but I don't think it's a legitimate position for our party to take." Right?
Mobeen.
Yeah. And I listened to him and I thought, man, he just kind of made takfir of her in like real time.
That's what I was saying.
Like you have to choose. Like this is like you have to choose whether or not you want to believe, right? And he put her into this corner, and I was like, wow, like just the total unwillingness to accept someone. And this is at a time when this guy needs votes, right? Like he needs votes. And you're open the door a little bit.
It was probably pretty calculated that he probably would gain more votes and being hardcore partisan than he would in being centrist.
Of course, right? At that time, you kind of have to move as far to the left as you can. But I think it's very indicative of just where a lot of these types of issues are at, where it's like, okay, well, at a different time, in a different era, you may have had a little bit more internal diversity within political parties. But now you don't really have a great deal of internal diversity when it comes to a lot of the core issues. The only areas where you have some diversity are, perhaps sometimes, tax issues, tax legislation. There's still some difference there. Militarism, you'll find some difference between the two parties. There are issues like that where you'll find some difference within the parties, where depending on the candidate, they may lie in sort of one direction or lean one direction or the other. But for the most part, when it comes to a lot of the core issues, there is a unanimity, right? There is a uniformity of position, uniformity of belief. And there's a very exacting demand for everyone to galvanize around those. And I think in an environment like that, if we're not even going to speak about our beliefs, if we're not going to see them as publicly defensible, if we're not going to instill in our community the confidence that they need to be Muslims in a full sense, I think what we're doing is we're leaving them to their own devices in a context where they are already feeling cornered. And they already feel as though, like they already feel like they can't be fully Muslim on an issue like this. And part of the reason I write about it is that I want them to know that they can. I want them to understand that. And I think that those types of efforts are worth it. Like, there's a brother, Wahid Jensen, who does a podcast called Way Beyond the Rainbow. He's a Muslim brother who experiences same-sex attractions, but he is very committed to the Quran and Sunnah. And he's done this podcast. It's now well over like 70 episodes. And he addresses this issue from every angle. I mean, psychologically, sociologically, politically, culturally, this is just every conceivable angle. And I always try to guide people to things like that, because it's so important for them to realize, like, even on the human question, we have answers to that. And he has done, like, the amount of research he's put, it's a remarkable feat. It is a remarkable
feat. I can't believe this is my first time hearing about this. Now, we had a number of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I actually have to take all. Oh, I can't wait. Oh, the comments. Let's see. Oh my goodness, I gotta. I'm just gonna pick some out.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh wait, some of them there's comments, mashallah. Really good comments. I would refer everybody to the chat. We got great comments from Sister Tricia. We got great brother Enosh. Let me see. Somebody asked the question, is it haram to use social media? No, it isn't haram to use social media, but it may not be a good idea. But it's not haram. Let me see. Sister Zara made. No, I think we're good. Okay, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. See here. Okay. I will refer everybody to the chat for comments. Mobeen, I'll give you the last word, my friend.
No, Jazakallah khair for the discussion. I really, it's always fun talking, right?
Of course. There's a lot of work to be done. Be done. I mean, I think like it's very comforting and reassuring to have a conversation like this, just in this literal bubble, just me and you and supporters of ALIM. But if we were having this conversation in front of an audience that included people of different faiths and walks of life, I can't tell you how much self-censoring and editing and I couldn't converse with the same freedom of expression. And I think about that disparity and what needs to be done to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the problems for us is when we internalize self-censorship, what begins to happen is that I think a lot of people, they do realize that. Mm-hmm. And when they realize that your sort of core members of your community, including your leaders and everyone else, don't really feel that don't really have a great degree of confidence or ability to even say what they believe on a set of issues, there's a question as to whether or not those issues are really even that serious for them. And, the only people who are very confident speaking about them are, left-wing political activists who take a very high-strung position that maximalizes LGBT affirmation in every space. And those are things that, if you're quiet about it, they don't really leave you alone. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a problem for us, because this isn't the type of issue where we can just retreat and say, well, we're going to be untouched by how widespread this issue is becoming. No, we're all going to get touched by it. In fact, it's an unavoidable part of our public discourse, especially in the West. No, so I agree. Given just how ubiquitous and widespread it is, we have to take it up, and that's a challenge for us. It really is a challenge for us, but inshallah, it's the type of challenge that we need to be willing to take on. So,
Jazakallah khair wa khitamuhu misk. The end of it is misk. Mobeen, it's been a great pleasure. I think I want to check in with you and see what your schedule is for the summer. We would love to have you come and maybe do a course for the ALIM summer program or something, man.
Inshallah. Although I'm sure you guys have better people than you.
No.
I'm sure.
No, I was thoroughly impressed with your clarity on a lot of these issues. I've talked to a lot of people about these issues, and you're able to address them carefully and with clarity and with conviction and principle, but no one can mistake you for someone that has just a kind of a an impassioned hatred for anybody, or an impassioned I think you strike your tone is really instructive, mashallah. So we'll talk more about that.
I think anybody who follows me will realize that this is an issue that I do care passionately about, right? Mm-hmm. Like I have a lot of, but you're right. It's like, okay, how do I bring that passion to bear in a way that's actually going to be persuasive to people who may disagree with me? And I recognize that there are a lot of Muslims who are struggling with this type of issue. And when we're dealing with people who are struggling, like we have to have a lot of sabr with them. And we have to minister to people, right? In a way that's bringing them closer to the faith. And I think there's a way to do that. But I don't think the way to do that is just going to be to antagonize them right from the
to badger people.
Just have open contempt for them.
I don't think that's ever worked. On any issue. Inshallah. We'll talk soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
What a great conversation. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank Ustadh Ubaydullah and Brother Mobeen for such a great conversation this evening. And I'd like to remind you again of the ALIM Spring program, that the registration is available for the ALIM Spring program now. You can go to alimprogram.com alimprogram.org/spring-program, where you can find information about our spring virtual program. It'll be from March 6th to April 10th on Istighfar and Toba. Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans, Sheikh Ali Sulaiman Ali, and Ustadh Zainab Ansari will be teaching that program, inshallah. And you can go to that link to register. And we also want to remind you about the ALIM summer program. If you go to alimprogram.org/summer-program, you can register there for our flagship summer program. There'll be a 3-week program where you'll have Ustadh Ubaydullah teach, Dr. Sherman Jackson, Sheikh Ali Sulaiman Ali, and Dr. Munir, and many other amazing teachers, where we have more conversations like these. And it's a really great program. I believe I was able to attend in the past, and it's a really great program for all Muslim Americans who want to engage with the Islamic tradition on topics that are relevant to our current context. And you can also join us next week for our ALIM book club, and we'll be reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is a great book that also kind of has themes that go with the topic we had today. So join us at alimprogram.org/book-club. You can join our program, and Ustadh Ubaydullah also participates in the book club discussions. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Assalamu alaikum.